and I am director of the George Herbert Society. Welcome to our plenary preview panel for the conference that would not be canceled. It's called George Herbert and Eloquence. It's coming next year from the 23rd to the 26th of June, 2022 at Cambridge University. We have a number of confirmed venues as announced through emails and at our website for our sessions and panels. The 23rd of June, Thursday, at Little St. Mary's Church, which is adjacent to Peterhouse. Friday, the 24th of June, Trinity College. Saturday, the 25th of June at Magdalen College. Sunday, the 26th of June at Clare College. Then at Leighton Bromswold and Little Gidding by Coach. As to registration, a large number of our participants have already registered and their registration has rolled over. New registration will go online at the George Herbert Society homepage early in the fall of 2021. As to lodging, we also will post coming in this fall links to various Cambridge lodging options. And for those seeking simple lodging, we are reserving a block of rooms at Churchill College, which is just west of the River Cam and west of St. John's College, fairly near the city center. But enough business. For other updates, please take a look at the George Herbert Society website. We'll be sending you email updates as well. Now for the conversation. Because this conference has been twice postponed, the conference planning committee, as well as our plenary speakers, have wanted to do something to fill the extended time of waiting as Britain and the rest of us anticipate our COVID Liberation Day. So we've invented the genre of the plenary preview panel. Each plenary speaker will talk for about 7 minutes, not necessarily as a formal paper prospectus, but more as an appetizer for the feast, or if you will, a trailer of coming attractions. Our speakers will present in approximate conference order, and although they need no introduction, I resolved to give brief and deliberately inadequate introductions and then allow them to take it away in that order. Once all 5 speakers have had their say, we'll field in the rest of the hour some of your questions and comments as sent through the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. The Zoom chat function, which you may well be familiar with, is not available during this webinar to prevent you all from passing notes to each other during class. This entire meeting is being recorded, and after a few days, it will be pasted or posted to the George Herbert Society website. And our panelists have agreed to review the Q&A transcript so that if their time and opportunity allows, they may answer at a later date. No promises, but a kind offer. So here goes in the way of very brief introductions of our panelists. Sydney Gottlieb, our first presenter, is professor of media studies at Sacred Heart University in Stamford, Connecticut, and the founding editor since 1977 of the George Herbert Journal, and also, in a wonderful meeting of 2 of my favorite worlds, editor of the Alfred Hitchcock Journal. His working title is A Life with George Herbert, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Helen Wilcox is Emeritus Professor of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at Bangor University in Wales, and like Sid, a co-founder of the George Herbert Society. She is editor of the English Poems of George Herbert in 2007 from Cambridge University Press. She is also the godmother of George Herbert Studies. Her working title is A Garden in a Paradise, The Eloquence of Place in Herbert's Temple. Rowan Williams is Archbishop Emeritus of Canterbury and Master Emeritus of Magdalen College, Cambridge, also previously Bishop of Monmouth and Archbishop of Wales. He is a theologian, poet, and Welsh bard. His working title is Eloquence and Stammering, Herbert's Disruptions of Rhetoric. Malcolm Geit is both chaplain emeritus and Byfellow emeritus of Girton College, Cambridge, and associate chaplain of St. Edward King and Martyr Church in Cambridge. A poet, rock, jazz, folk musician, and motorcycle enthusiast, he is also a smoker of extravagant pipes. His working title is Herbert as Muse, the Generative Eloquence of Prayer 1. And finally, Seamus Perry is professor of English literature at the University of Oxford and fellow and tutor of Balliol College, Oxford, with a specialty in English Romantic and post-Romantic poetry. With Sir Christopher Ricks and Freya Johnston, he co-edits the journal Essays in Criticism. His working title, the last time that I checked, was Modernist Herbert, Eliot, Auden, and Empson. Our first speaker, Sid Gottlieb, will commence.
We were asked to talk briefly about what we'll say next year, but I want to start by talking briefly about something I would have done last year and will no longer be able to do. I knew that the most interesting and important part of my presentation would come when I sprang a big surprise. I had arranged with Chauncey Wood to make a video recording so he could make an appearance at an event he knew he wouldn't be able to make it to in person, say hello, talk a little bit about his years with Herbert, and alas, say his farewell to us. This was not to be. He wasn't able to make the video. The conference was postponed. He died. But I do want Chauncey to make an appearance today and offer my and our farewell to him with an eloquence not my own, but in true Herbert fashion that I might be a vehicle for. Chauncey Wood, Something Understood. Well, I have about 5 minutes left, but that should be fine. I think there's a place for what one of my favorite clerics, Father Guido Sarducci, described long ago on Saturday Night Live as the 5-minute university, an education that focuses on presenting not everything, but just what someone is likely to remember years later. And so here's my stripped down report on where Herbert was when I met him, where he is now, and where we might take him, emphasizing in particular ways we approach Herbert differently now than we did 50 years ago. Herbert's lyrics are carefully connected, not only to poems that might lie 10 leaves away, but to the poems immediately before and after, in sequences that exploit and also in some ways explode linearity. These other poems don't merely gloss a lyric, but are an essential and not to be overlooked part of its drama and meaning. This markedly enhances our understanding of the poems and of Herbert's mastery of the lyric form. We have an even further expanded sense of Herbert's intertextuality. There's always been a sense of how the Bible is woven into his poems, but we're now more ready to accept his knowing and complexly dialectical relationship with an extensive range of poems and prose works, religious and secular. Not that many years ago, few would have pictured Herbert as having international connections. Now, especially after a conference on the subject, we continue to add evidence of his interest in and engagement with a world of literature and ideas beyond the academic cloister we used to enclose him in. We now have a deeper understanding of and commitment to taking into account Herbert's immersion in the social and political world when we reckon with what is reflected in and reflected on in his poetry. The texture and themes of his poems are grounded in the specificity of day-to-day life activities, private and public, personal and political. And the purposes of his poetry, why he wrote it, and what effects he hoped it might have, include concern for life as well as afterlife. Next year, I'll have more to say about Herbert as a centrifugal as well as centripetal poet, inward and outward as well as upward looking, ever the poet and the caring parson, and with a broad sacramental sense of communion and community. And what of the 800-pound gorilla in the room of Herbert's studies, his theology? For as much interest as there continues to be in aligning Herbert with one party or another, there is an increasingly persuasive counterargument emphasizing his eclecticism, bricolage, openness, and gravitation toward non-doctrinaire approaches to life. I say the following humbly and respectfully, especially knowing the company I am in. Spirituality, like ethics, is a subject too vast and spacious to be left only in the hands of theologians. And there may be something to be said for spending some of the energy devoted to Herbert's doctrinal theology to a broader study of his spirituality. In part because of the developments I've just outlined, Herbert seems much less the miniaturist that he was often pictured as. Praise of him as the sweet singer of Bemerton gives a limited view of his tone and his reach. But in the same way that, say, Jane Austen and Emily Dickinson are now recognized as covering big subjects on small canvases, Herbert at last seems larger, less local and provincial. Herbert, in Thoreau's manner, traveled widely in Bemerton, and in Bob Dylan's words, contains multitudes, a complexity, variability, and richness that is best described as and approached by what Lewis Martz calls generous ambiguity. Finally, we've witnessed, and I hope will continue to witness, the growth of the Herbert apparatus, the structures that help us cultivate him. These are not, as Stanley Fish suggests, self-serving institutions to keep academics in business, but faithful, communal efforts. The animating spirit behind the Friends of Bemerton, the George Herbert Journal, and the George Herbert Society is, if you build it, they will come. And look, here we are. But calling this an apparatus is too cold. What I'm talking about is the growth of the Herbert family, working with and for each other, running a journal, compiling a scholarly edition, writing a new biography, holding a conference, maintaining the houses of Herbert. All that takes a family and makes a family. My more than 7 minutes next year will allow me to say more about how the most valuable part of my 50 years with Herbert has been my 50 years with Herbertians and the intimacy, warmth, and fun of this thing of ours. Now here comes one of those embarrassingly personal things that Chris encouraged us to include in our talks. Truly one of my most valuable possessions is a gift from Louis Martz, a copy of his edition of Herbert with the inscription, "To Sid Gottlieb, keeper of the Herbert Vineyard." My great pleasure has been, is, and I hope will continue to be, joining with all of you as keepers of the Herbert Vineyard. And with that in mind, I raise my glass and say to and for us all, L'chaim, next year in Cambridge.
Thank you, Sid. 50 years. Helen Wilcox.
Thank you, Sid. That was absolutely lovely. Now, my working title is A Garden in a Paradise, the Eloquence of Place in Herbert's Temple. And I should say from the beginning that by place, I don't mean status or great place, as Herbert himself described it, but physical locations. My question is, how do places speak in his poetry? And Herbert himself, of course, was associated in his lifetime with several specific locations: Wales, London, Cambridge, Bemerton. And of course, we hope to be in one of those, Cambridge, next year. There are occasional hints of these places in his poems: The Lingering Gown of Cambridge University and Affliction 1, the watercourse perhaps recalling the water meadows between Bemerton and Salisbury. But he's not really a writer like Henry Vaughan, for example, whose poems repeatedly evoke a specific environment. For Vaughan, the Usk Valley, and he gave himself the label, the Swan of Usk. And there's nothing like that in Herbert. We'd be wrong, I think, to look for that kind of eloquence of place in his poetry. Just as Herbert's speaker in Redemption is wrong to go searching for God first in heaven and then in cities, theatres, gardens, parks and courts, and then he's surprised to discover God and his redeeming love at work in the chaos and cruelty of Calvary. Well, I hope to show next year that Herbert's eloquence of place is a bit like the effect of that poem. It's unexpected, but it's redemptive. So to answer my overall question, how do places speak in Herbert's poetry? I'll be investigating the kinds of places that I think are significant in the temple. And as my title suggests, these will include gardens. Unfallen man is a garden in a paradise, perfection in perfection, the ideal place. But that's all gone, and that poem is not called Misery for nothing. Now, Herbert's poems are not in Eden. They're not visiting the enchanted groves of pastoral poetry rejected by him in Jordan 1, but they observe the small, telling, natural details of place. For example, that the rose's root is ever in its grave, in virtue. His poems read the natural world around us, seeing and hearing its eloquence, and often, though not always, finding God in it. The world's thy book, he says to God in longing. The eloquence of place is potentially divine. But to reverse that saying, the world's thy book, Herbert's book is also a world, a place in itself, indeed a building, the temple, in which every man doth speak of God's honour, as the psalm on the title page says. And I want to explore textual places too, as well as buildings like the temple that are so eloquent in Herbert's writing. The church with its floor and its windows, the stones of the altar never ceasing in their praise, their eloquent praise of God. But also he's fascinated by humble, homely buildings, welcoming places, a stable with a manger in it, lodgings, or the inn implied in Love 3. Most important, I think, are the very modest, metaphorical inner places, the believer's heart in Good Friday, the subtle rooms of the heart and soul in Holy Communion, and the place of worship whose best frame and fabric is within, as he says in Zion. So it may turn out to be that the most significant places in Herbert's poetry are not defined by their beauty, their elegance, or their grandeur, but by what happens in them, which I think is rather like Herbert's understanding of how a true hymn works, when the soul unto the lines accords, the soul unto the place must accord. Let me end by reading a very short poem, The Quiddity, to focus our minds perhaps on some of these possible places and what they have to say or do in Herbert's handling. The Quiddity. My God, a verse is not a crown, no point of honour or gay suit, no hawk or banquet or renown, nor a good sword, nor yet a lute. It cannot vault or dance or play. It never was in France or Spain, nor can it entertain the day with a great stable or demesne. It is no office, art or news, nor the exchange or busy hall, but it is that which while I use, I am with thee, and most take all. Many places are mentioned and quickly rejected here. The settings of feasts and dances, foreign countries, official locations like the exchange or the busy hall. What matters is the place where we are with God. So there's a sense in which we might say Herbert's always in two places at once, like us on Zoom, actually, with that double motion maybe that we have in Colossians 3:3, the sense of places both physical and metaphysical, earthly and heavenly, material and textual. His verse creates and inhabits a particular setting, and yet it's always seeing beyond it, as in the elixir, to spy the heavens. So this is a little snapshot of some of the things I'll be exploring, to use rather an apt metaphor, in Herbert's poetic places, and the many ways in which I believe they speak to us so eloquently today. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Rowan Williams.
Thank you. Lord, how can man preach thy eternal word? He is a brittle, crazy glass. For Herbert, as for any good reformed Christian, the question of what authority you could possibly have for speaking in God's name is a pressing question not just of theory but of practice, of poetic practice. How could any human voice presume to speak, in some sense, for God? And there's no doubt at all that Herbert does purport to speak for God in his poetry, not just in the abstract sense that he is preaching in his poems, but very concretely, in a rhetoric which allows God to be heard directly in what he says. He gives us a bit of a clue, of course, in his advice in pastoral practice in A Priest to the Temple, telling us that when the priest is preaching, he should from time to time, quite literally, turn towards the altar and ask God to speak, ask God to commend what is being said to the hearts of the listeners. In other words, the eloquence of the pulpit is an eloquence that at times, quite properly, shuts itself up, turns towards the primary speaker, the primary word, to set that free for the hearer. How do you do that in a poem? That is, to me, one of the most fascinating and perpetually challenging aspects of Herbert's poetics. To watch him trying to deal with that question of the authority to speak of, for, and to God. How to deal with the question of showing the authority on which he depends. We were encouraged, as we've been reminded, to be a little bit autobiographical, and certainly when I first encountered Herbert as a schoolboy, it was the Herbert of what you might call the cultivated Anglican back garden that I primarily encountered. And I loved that, but at first found others like John Donne a little bit more interesting and exciting. It's a very adolescent response. And it took me a while to read Herbert afresh as someone who is constantly upsetting his own apple cart, constantly upsetting his own tidiness and order. And for many years I've been intrigued by what I've called the eloquence of stammering. That is, the particular kind of eloquence which Herbert undertakes, designed to interrupt his own best moments. If it's one of the most significant bits of advice you can give to any writer to kill their darlings, Herbert is a mass murderer, and someone who is by no means averse to subverting his own best effects. I could go through many examples in Jordan 1, in Dialogue, in The Collar, Grief, Denial, and so on, instances where Herbert not only undertakes what is for him quite a regular tactic of ending abruptly, ending with sharply and heavily monosyllabic lines, but more directly interrupts himself, breaks rhythm or rhyme, and of course famously in dialogue, interrupts God, to silence God because what is being said cannot be borne. Ah, no more, thou breaks my heart. So to read those poems and to read Herbert's rhetoric in that particular light is to see his self-interruptions, his self-subversions, his irregularities, deliberately invited irregularities, as motivated by his attempt to answer that basic theological question: what is the eloquence appropriate to someone dependent on the word of God? It can't in any sense attempt to rival the word of God. It can't imitate the eloquence of the word of God, except insofar as the eloquence of the word of God is itself a self-emptying, self-subverting eloquence. It's a word which enters into chaos and noise, as in redemption, that enters finally into silence. And it was, of course, Herbert's older contemporary, Richard Hooker, who famously said that where God is concerned, our safest eloquence is silence. No poet can just be silent, and no preacher can be silent. The call is to speak. But the question is how to speak, and how to speak in such a way that the speaking itself carries the space for listening. The otherness of a voice has to be evoked in the poetry. And so, whether Herbert is preaching or writing poetry, he is seeking a vehicle for conveying the listening dimension, the readiness to be interrupted, the readiness to be spoken to, which is also the readiness not simply to act, but to be acted upon. Sidney rightly reminded us that an awful lot of ink has been spent, query wasted, on tracing Herbert's exact theological affiliations. But since every member of the Church of England at this point was some kind of Calvinist, then it's fair enough to say that Herbert is trying to articulate a Calvinist dependence on the word, by which I don't mean, of course, that that is an exclusively Calvinist feature. But picking up what Helen has said, the unexpectedness of Herbert's poetry is his way of showing true dependence, a listening ear, an attentive response, creating a poetry that is, and a rhetoric that is not so much coercive or persuasive in its own right, but which achieves its persuasion by interrupting itself, by silencing itself, relativizing itself. Herbert being Herbert, of course, that's not simply a resignation. When he says in Affliction 1, with wonderful lack of conviction, I must be meek, we know perfectly well that that is itself an expression of resistance. But the very fact of resistance, by demonstrating the fibrous density of that which it pushes against in the Word of God, once again expresses in its own way the there-ness, the otherness, and, if you want to be theological, the sovereignty of that word whose ultimate eloquence is what remains the rationale, the foundation, and the goal of everything that Herbert says and does. And that's the sense in which his stammering, his interruption, his deliberately invited and curated irregularities, how all of those become part of a rhetoric for God. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. If we can make Malcolm guide out in that cloud, we invite him to begin now.
Thank you very much. I apologize for the cloud, but as you did mention my pipe, I thought I might indulge, but I'll put it down for a moment. So my title, my tentative title was Herbert as Muse, the Generative Eloquence of Prayer. I think if I'm allowed to revise it in any way, I might add the word the generative and generous eloquence of Prayer 1. Prayer 1 is a poem of extraordinary abundance. I mean, it begins, of course, with the phrase prayer, the church's banquet. And what you get is a banquet. Some people have reckoned that in that short poem, just 14 lines, the sonnet, which has this extraordinary outpouring and abundance of images, but it doesn't even have a verb, as it were. Some people have counted 27 images, but that's because they include something understood. I count 26 for the letters of the alphabet, and I count something understood as a kind of modest assessment of what we've got so far and a promise of what might yet be found on every fresh reading. But I want to start with the sheer sense of the generosity of this poem. If I can speak, since we were asked to be autobiographical, if I can speak for a moment as a working poet, I can tell you that you can wait a long time for just one good image. And by image, I don't mean a picture in your mind. I mean something which will be promising, which will be fruitful, which will be worth examining, which will contain a paradox, which will open out, which will give more to the poem than the poet knows when he finds the image. That's what you're looking for. And believe me, you can wait weeks for one. I have a little hut at the bottom of the garden, which I sometimes think of as my trysting place with the muse. And most of the times I show up, and she says, "Not tonight, dear, I'm washing my hair." But you wait. And eventually you get an image. You might get one or two and you think, oh, an image, thank you. I could probably squeeze 3 poems out of this. And along comes George Herbert, and he gets 26 absolute gems. But gems isn't quite the right word. A gem is finished, it's faceted, it's crafted. And of course, there's a great deal of finish and faceting and craft in Herbert's poem. But these aren't so much gems as seeds. They're ready to open out. And he gets 26 of them and gives them all to you. He gives them all away in one poem. There's a lifetime's worth of poetry just in this one poem. And he even leaves you to do the nurturing and the growing, to see this thing unfold. It is quite astonishing. And I love the way, to change metaphor again, when and of course, the whole poem consists of a series of 26 changes of metaphor. It's absolutely wonderful. He uses his opening metaphor as the banquet. And some people, I think, have quite rightly seen the poem itself as being like the lovely anticipatory menu card that you get if you sit down at a real banquet, and you can see in advance what's coming to you, and course after course of hospitality. So I want to just remark on that and just see it as this extraordinarily generous and generative gift. And I call it generative because what I hope to talk about when we do, next year in Cambridge, when we gather, is to show you some of the things that it has generated, and to look at the way in which different poets have been inspired by this poem, been encouraged by this poem, and found in this poem a possibility for their own poetry that they wouldn't have found otherwise at all. And I'm just really going to use the little bit of my time here just to give you a quick sampling. I'm going to give you two poets whom I greatly admire, and I'm going to finish with some of the things that I myself have found given and received from Herbert. So there's an absolutely fabulous poem called Homecoming by the great Welsh poet Gwyneth Lewis, who told me once that she, I don't know by what quite connection, but she reckons she draws her family partly out of Herbert's, that there's a sort of genealogical as well as a clear poetical connection and inheritance. And in her poem Homecoming, which is part of her Illinois Idylls and prefaced by a little gloss that says, "So let us live out odes to simplicity," she takes the example of Herbert's form in prayer, which is the kind of listing poem, but it's more than an example of form. There's a kind of beautiful conversation between what he's able to say about prayer and what she wants to say at this stage and phase in her life. This is from Parables and Faxes, which first came out in 1995, and she's grown and developed in extraordinary ways as a poet since then. But let me just give you a sample of Homecoming, and you'll feel immediately both its debt to prayer, but more powerfully, the way it richly repays that debt. Here's a little sampling. I shan't read the whole of it, otherwise I might have her publishers onto me for this sort of thing. But here we go. Homecoming. Two rivers deepening into one. Less said, more meant. A field of corn adjusting to harvest. A battle won by yielding. Days emptied to their brim. And going on, it says this, things like this. Not doing but being, a single noun. Now in infinity. Now, I can't help feeling that now in infinity bears some relation to heaven in ordinary, just the kind of syntactical possibility of it. And there's a huge amount to be thought about how, if you wanted to suggest the profundity of a spiritual experience, but you didn't want to speak the language of Zion, you didn't want to assume any of the apparatus of, the church at all, let alone the Church of England, and you wanted to speak a language that a secularist might connect with, and yet try and point to the same generative place. Now in infinity is an astonishingly beautiful way of doing it. So there's Gwyneth Lewis picking up from that. And she told me, I remember having a conversation with her, in which she talked specifically about Herbert's prayer having been the inspiration for this. Another contemporary poet, again, with whom I was fortunate to have a conversation in which she talked about Herbert and Herbert's generous and generative influence on her, was Ruth Padell. And in her whole sequence in her book about going to India and looking for tigers, she has this extraordinary poem, Tiger Drinking at Forest Pool, which starts with this wonderfully evocative water, moonlight, danger, dream, which opens you into all kinds of intuitive and suggestive possibilities. But here's just a little bit of that. And again, I think you'll feel the sense in which Herbert himself has created the space in which this poem is possible. Treasure found but lost, flirting between the worlds of lost and found, an unjust law repealed, a wish come true, a lifelong sadness healed, haven in the mind to anyone hurt by littleness. That's an amazingly beautiful haven in the mind to anyone hurt by littleness. But there's something about heaven and haven, which of course is, Hopkins makes heaven and haven work together, but she's doing something through Hopkins with Herbert, I think there, which is extraordinary. Now, both of those poets have taken from Herbert the idea, as it were, of this intuitive, evocative, generous giving of a sequence out of which we, each time we come to it, can make something new. But another way in which one might receive from Herbert's generosity or taste his banquet, sit and eat, as it were, rather than simply admire and make scholarly discourse, is to take one of those images and just sit with it and work with it. And I've, for some years, been leading retreats and quiet days using this poem and asking people to find the image which seemed to stay or rest with them. And it's been really extraordinary how that's worked out and grown out. And I want to eventually, having told people that they ought to do that and they ought to take one image at a time and really dwell with it, I finally got to be on a retreat myself, which is much needed. And I thought, well, perhaps I should take a leaf out of my own book. And I began on this retreat and then completed over the kind of course of a year a sequence of poems called After Prayer, which was both written after reading the poem Prayer, where after prayer in the sense that one might be after, looking for, going towards, and we're after prayer in the sense that prayer was involved in the composition of the poems. And I found that using each of those images in prayer and then finally reflecting on something understood, was extraordinarily fecund and helpful and fruitful in terms of my own poetic practice. And I felt perhaps that's just the very sort of thing that Herbert might have wanted us to do. Now, right at the heart, in fact, the two poems, if you think of the 2 lines, if you think of the 14 lines of the sonnet as also having a kind of mirroring, or right at the folding place of the sonnet, the 2 central lines in prayer are lines which relate to music, because as we know, music was central to who Herbert was. His memory of a good deed was music at midnight. I'm sure he heard his sort of his mentor and in a sense genial honorary uncle John Donne preach as he did so eloquently on music, and certainly knew his poem, "Since I am coming to that holy room where with the choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music. I tune my instrument here at the door." And so right in the center of that poem is the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear. And there's a wonderful kind of half rhyme on hour and fear. There's all kinds of things going on. And the notion of prayer as transposition and prayer as hearing a melody is very fruitful. So I'd just like to close the little bit that I've got, I still have time, by reading you simply in sequence and without further comment, the 2 poems which were generated for me by Herbert's generous and generative eloquence. The 6 days world transposing in an hour. 24/7 in the 6 days world, in endless cycles of unnerving news, relentlessly, our restless hurts are hurled through empty cyberspace. Is there no muse to make of all that pain an elegy, or in those waves of white noise to discern Christ's inner cantus firmus, that deep tone that might give rise at last to harmony? We may not seal it off, or drown it out, nor close our hearts down in the hour of prayer, but listening through dissonance and doubt, wait in the space between until we hear a change of key, a secret chord disclosed, a kind of tune, and all the world transposed. And then a kind of tune. A kind of tune, a music everywhere and nowhere, love's long, lovely undersong, a trace in time, a grace note in the air, born to us from the place where we belong, on every passing breeze and in the breath of every creature, all things hear and fear. For faintly, through our fall, we too may hear the strong song of the sun that undoes death. And one day we will hear it unimpaired, the joy of all the sorrowful, the song of all the saints who cry, how long, the hidden hope of all who have despaired. He sang it to his mother in the womb, and now it echoes from his empty tomb.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. And for those who are interested in reading more of Malcolm's After Prayer, we actually have it posted at the George Herbert Society website in its entirety. It's very generous of Malcolm to allow us to do that. Now we will turn to Seamus Perry.
Thank you, and thank you to all the other speakers. Really wonderful talks. So you said Empson was part of my title, and indeed he was, and I do hope when we meet up in person I will say something about Empson, and especially this very controversial reading of the Sacrifice that provokes a lot of debate in Herbert criticism in the 20th century. But I don't have anything about Empson today. I haven't quite worked my thoughts out about that yet. So Anglo-American modernism, especially as it's shaped by T.S. Eliot, claimed affiliations with those poets of the 17th century who Augustan taste had considered cranky and odd, and to whom they attach the deliberately unflattering label metaphysical, and Donne and Marvell obviously are some big names in this very Eliot-inspired notion of literary history. And I thought it might be interesting to ask where Herbert fitted into that sort of narrative. A regard for Herbert obviously predates the modernists. George Watson dates the revival of Herbert's fortunes very precisely to the appreciative mention that Coleridge makes of him in Biographia Literaria, which comes out in 1817. With the important exception of Cooper, 18th century readers seem not to have taken much to Herbert, outside at least the Wesleyan chapel. So Coleridge's praise was a very deliberate attempt to overturn a set of literary criteria which had found in Herbert's style merely the defect of quaintness, as it was called. And what Coleridge admires, it's important to stress, because I think this is what continues into the modern poets I'm going to mostly talk about. What Coleridge admires is a style, but a style that also captures or implies a kind of personality, a kind of creative personality. In The Temple, Coleridge says in Biographia, the scholar and the poet supplies the material, but the perfect, well-bred gentleman, the expressions and the arrangement. So what are the virtues of gentlemen that Coleridge is admiring here? Well, they seem to be those of a kind of conversible ease, of a kind of unabashed acknowledgement of shared humanity, that, you know, that wonderful formative English social myth that it's the toffs and the workers that get on. It's only the kind of muddlesome middle class that get in the way and spoil social harmony. It's that sort of sense of being at ease in a kind of a shared humanity, and also an instinct not to stand on ceremony. And that's rather brilliantly glossed in a letter that Coleridge writes the year after Biographia, which I'm sure is known to all of you, where he says, I find more substantial comfort now in pious George Herbert's Temple, which I used to read to amuse myself with his quaintness, in short, only to laugh at, than in all the poetry since the poems of Milton. So he's offering a little story of his own conversion, as it were, away from Augustan standards of taste and into new standards of taste, which I suppose we might want to call romantic. And he goes on, to me, such a phrase as and relish versing is a sincerity, a reality, which I would unwillingly exchange for the more dignified and once more love the muse, etc. And so with many other of Herbert's homely phrases. Well, Eliot said that the appreciation Eliot too said that the appreciation Herbert enjoyed was primarily the work of Coleridge, the great critic, as Eliot said in the talk he gave at Salisbury Cathedral, whose revolutionary activity appears in many directions. The modernist literary revolution of which Eliot was a leading part, like its romantic precursor, sought to reacquaint the language of poetry with the language of ordinary life. So you can see why what Coleridge calls the homely phrases of Herbert might have appealed. The other word that's used consistently is the word simplicity, talking here mostly about diction rather than about grammar. In the verse of George Herbert, said Eliot, simplicity is carried as far as it can go, a simplicity emulated without success by numerous modern poets. But for all that, Herbert is not one of the exemplary figures in those great polemical pieces that Eliot writes in the 1920s about the metaphysical poets. And when he talks about that terrible thing that in his theory happens to the English mind around the time of the Civil War, what he calls a dissociation of sensibility, it was another Herbert that he turns to. He says rather darkly, something happened to the mind of England between the time of Donne or Lord Herbert of Charbury and the time of Tennyson and Browning. So it's the other Herbert that he chooses there to be exemplary. But the older Anglican Eliot turned to Lord Herbert's brother and found what are, in very much Coleridge's terms, what he describes as the language of ordinary speech, only of a classical purity and directness, an easy conversational familiarity, even homeliness, that Herbert communicates with us as one person to another. A man, I like this a lot, a man with a sturdy mind who faces the facts of life. That's how he describes Herbert. And Herbert, I think, increasingly mattered to Eliot, not just the Eliot of four quartets, but the Eliot of social criticism and lots of other things too. Herbert was the subject of one of the very last things that Eliot ever wrote, which is a pamphlet of British councils, writers, and their work series, in which he contrasts him with Donne, a comparison he had made before, but which he now puts at his most emphatic. Donne wrote with wit, Eliot says, in that pamphlet, a kind of what he's by now thinking of as sort of a flashy kind of conjoining performativeness, the sort of thing that Johnson singles out in Cowley to disapprove of in the Metaphysicals. But when Herbert writes in Prayer, the poem that we've been listening to, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something undisturbed, then, Eliot says, he writes the kind of poetry which, like magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn, may be called magical. That's hardly to praise Herbert for his ordinary speech, but you can see that the deepest appeal might lie actually in the combination of that conversational familiarity on the one hand, and this openness to a kind of numinousness on the other. And I think it's that extraordinary combination that Herbert represents, exemplifies in other modern writers too. And that's what I hope to talk about when we meet in person in Cambridge. Auden, for example, also has a late interest in Herbert. Most of Auden's career, he's not particularly interested in Herbert. But when the Eliot pamphlet comes out, I think an interest begins to grow. And you can see Auden reworking some of the things that Eliot says. So, for example, Auden says, in one essay, John Donne, great as he is, I find an insufferable prima donna. Give me George Herbert every time. That's what he says in the New Yorker. And he did a selection of Herbert for Faber, one of his last books. And in the introduction to that, you can see the main elements of this Coleridge-Eliot line of praise still alive and well. Auden says rather touchingly that Herbert is one of the very few poets that you would actually like to meet. You'd actually like to know him. So that admiration there is due, as I was saying a moment ago, to an exemplary kind of personality as much as to a merely poetic manner. One might also say, Auden says, perhaps a little self-conscious at sounding so old-fashioned, that Anglican piety at its best, as represented by Herbert, is the piety of a gentleman. And there is the Coleridgean language again. But Herbert, for Auden, is also capable of what Eliot had called magic. And Auden quotes those same lines from Prayer, and comments that in them, and this is rather a stretch, anyway, he says in them, Herbert seems to foreshadow Malame, which I suppose means a kind of a magical sort of poetical discourse that reaches towards the mysteries of symbolism. And it's that same admixture of voices that lies at the heart of Elizabeth Bishop's reverence for Herbert, about which there's a lot more to be said, I think. And what she admired, she said so much in a letter, was his innate balance or normalcy. And I think what's at stake is what's being balanced. And what's being balanced, as I say, is this wonderful kind of mixture of the prosaic on the one hand and the numinous on the other. And a similar kind of role is played by Herbert, really interestingly, in Seamus Heaney's inaugural lecture as Professor of Poetry at Oxford in 1989, where Herbert is held up as representing what Heaney calls sanity and vigor, a via media between preciousness and vulgarity, which exemplifies an ideal mental and emotional climate. So, I mean, obviously in Heaney's case, these are ethical virtues that have an immediate kind of political translation as well, which is something else. Well, we may not, and Heaney doesn't talk about gentlemen's virtues, we may not think of these in terms of well-bred gentlemen anymore. And Heaney himself in the lecture, which is a very canny piece of writing, is keenly aware that the myth of Englishness that he's drawing upon is associated with a history of colonialism and nationalistic self-justification. But nevertheless, he celebrates the mind that he sees in Herbert, which is a kind of psychologized version of Anglican in-betweenness that he obviously reverences and reveres. And it's, as I say, it's recognizable as a Coleridgean virtue. Balance is too placid a word, Heaney says, for the distribution of competing energies within Herbert's imagination. But nevertheless, it's a kind of dynamic balance all the same. And crucially, and this is my last point, one of the energies that Heaney finds brought into the complex, balanced economy of a Herbert poem is the unprompted delight in poetry, something in itself free of any doctrinal duty or homiletic purpose. In the inaugural, Heaney calls this the surprising local effect of lyric joy. And it's key to Heaney's thinking about poetry at large, that whatever moral or political obligations or religious or theological obligations a poem might find itself contracting, the historical innocence or the theoretical innocence of its most fundamental lyric impulse remains untainted. That's, as it were, the heart of Heaney's entire aesthetic thinking. And in an interview with Dennis O'Driscoll, he spoke of the importance of this whole position and turns to Herbert to try and conceptualize it. He writes of a poem that he has in one of his later books. The interviewer says, you know, why did you write this poem? And Heaney says, I wrote it to keep the lyric faith, to trust in what you might call the George Herbert syndrome. And now in age I bud again, small smell the dew and rain and relish versing. And that George Herbert syndrome, I think, is quite an important thing. Those were the lines you remember that had spoken especially to Coleridge. His relish versing was the thing that Coleridge loved so much. Eliot too very prominently quotes those lines, as well as Coleridge's comments upon them, which I gave you earlier on in his little Writers in Their Workbook. Elizabeth Bishop, writing during a depression to the Herbert scholar Joseph Summers, says, I just wish I'd reached the point of the next to last stanza on page 228, which is the relish versing stanza. And she adds in that letter, but it looks a long way off. But even, or perhaps especially in its lamented absence, that idea of Herbertian relish remains, it seems to me, a surprisingly widespread element in the way modern poets think about their art and their practice. And it's something that I hope I can say a bit more about when we meet in Cambridge in some months' time.
Thank you so much, all of you. Let me begin by posing a question from Justin Lewis Anthony to Helen Wilcox. Is the eloquence of place connected to the particularity of place? And if so, how, in your view? Helen?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. I think the answer is yes. Although I think Herbert moves out from having been inspired by the particularity of things. As I said, the small detail. He's particularly interested in small places, and a lot of people have written about him, and enclosed spaces and boxes and so on. That's very evocative for him, but he never stays there. I think something I want to explore next year is the way in which, although places are by definition fixed, his use of them is always very fluid, that there is a way in which the stimulus of the particular leads him then into something greater, something more fluent and exploratory and open, and in a way then transcends space. But he needs, I think he needs that particularity, that's material specificity. But that is always a stage on the way somewhere. So you might say place is a process rather than just a thing or a physical specific entity. I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Yes, well, I can't, I'll have to wait to hear what Justin Lewis Anthony would say.
He's very welcome to email me if we want to carry on conversation.
Well, let me turn now and ask if you have some questions or comments for each other. If you can all unmute, and we could have a bit of an exchange. I have some questions for all of you, but I wanted to give you some space to inquire of and comment on each other.
Could I just pick up as a comment, a response to Seamus Perry's thing, which I really enjoyed. But I was really fascinated by you picking up again different people from Eliot onwards, quoting that, yeah, now in age I bud again, I once more smell the dew and rain and relish versing, because it brought back, just this is purely anecdotal, a very vivid memory. We were able happily, when the T.S. Eliot Festival had begun to happen in Little Gidding, to invite Heaney to that, and I spent the day with him there, and he actually read Little Gidding itself there, but he was clearly as excited about the George Herbert connections and the sense that the manuscript of the Temple had been sent there. And we sort of started spontaneously talking about Herbert, and he just looked, he kind of looked around and breathed in, and of course he, recovered. He suddenly said, And now in age I bud again. I once more started to rain and relish versing. And he said the words relish versing with such relish. You know, it's a real case of a poet tasting another poet's words. And it was a magical moment in that place, talking about Helen and place and that time, to hear Heaney recite Herbert at Little Gidding was definitely on my bucket list.
Absolutely, sounds wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
Could
He
I
says
add
in that funny little interview, I mean, enormous interview he gives when he talks about the George Herbert syndrome. He says that the quality of that line is such that you could imagine that in different circumstances Herbert would have been a great erotic poet, because there's something about, you know, the intensity of you know, the sheer pleasure of the aesthetic.
Yeah. Well, it's arguable that he was a great erotic poet in one sense.
Yeah,
Erotic.
Yes. Helen.
I was just going to add, thank you so much to all my fellow speakers, really inspiring hour we've had. I wanted to add another poet to Seamus's list. I know it's not at all an exhaustive list, and it was wonderful the way you worked your way from Coleridge right through to Elizabeth Bishop and so on. Coincidentally, Rowan and I are both speaking tomorrow in the R.S. Thomas Festival online. And I think, and again, it comes through editing. And I mean, if we're going to be personal, I feel I know Sir Herbert so well because of having edited him over a long period. And these poets whom we're citing, who made selections or editions, and it applies to R.S. Thomas as well, really get a kind of, you know, that close association, getting inside, getting under the skin. And I only have a tiny slot tomorrow, but I'm doing a close reading of a particular poem of R.S. Thomas's that I think has lying behind it, funnily enough, The Flower by Herbert, and the returns of God. So it continues, and so Ron and I will be thinking about R.S. tomorrow.
Yeah, I first read Herbert in R.S. Thomas's little Faber selection. I pulled that off the shelf as a sixth former and was utterly transformed. So R.S. Thomas's introduction to Herbert was my introduction to Herbert, and remains formative for how I read Herbert.
I remember buying that when it first came out in the 60s and having a very similar reaction. But I wonder, Helen, could I just come back to the place question for a moment? We've talked about this before in different contexts, but you made the contrast with Vaughan. And one of the things I often think about that fascinating contrast and complementarity is Herbert's spaces, Herbert's places are mostly humanized, aren't they? They're inhabited spaces. They're domestic is perhaps putting it a bit too narrowly, but they're certainly indoors rather than outdoors. They already carry, as it were, usage, inhabitation, psychology, and so forth. Is there any point at which you think he does step outside into something less less inhabited, less humanized? I can't immediately think, but
I think that's a wonderful point. Yeah, he is talking about gardens, not grand sort of formal gardens, which he rejects, but it is gardens and not landscapes, isn't it? Yeah, it's not the Usk Valley, it's the domesticated enclosed place. I mean, he's very interested in enclosing and the enclosure and the sort of the nesting, the safety of that. I agree. I don't think there is an instance of his going to, as it were, a wilderness, a place without human interaction with the place, and I think that's partly an incarnational aspect to his faith. I think it's not a kind of the God that is simply present in the experience of the natural world. It's a God who has intervened into the human world, into human history, and who therefore has been in places, and Herbert kind of, as it were, follows that.
Yep.
Whether he's, whether it's at the foot of the cross or in the inn where he's being welcomed in to the banquet and so on. So I think it's a wonderful point that you make, and I agree that I don't think he goes beyond that, but I would say I don't think that's a limitation. It's more a perspective on the way in which places and people and places and God interact. It's what happens in those places that really matters, and therefore there have to be people there to make things happen, as it were, or God there to make something happen.
I think maybe the nearest he gets to that wider conspectus of nature is in Providence, where he does list all kinds of things and the fishes and the birds. But there it's precisely to say that man must step in and voice the praise. Man is the world's high priest.
Yes.
But then he does give this one. I mean, it's quite a nice survey, but he sees it all as almost waiting for the human voice to utter it.
And serving as well, in the sense that, if you get stung by something, then next to it there is the cure. It's a very medicinal kind of sense of the natural world. Yeah.
Well, I would invite Sid perhaps to comment on this too, because of the George Herbert Journal special issue on locating George Herbert, which I sort of co-edited with him. We dealt extensively with this question and essentially touched on many of the things that you've said so succinctly here. That there's a striking lack of specific geographical location in Herbert's work. They are interior spaces. There are moments, as in Providence, perhaps also in the Pilgrimage, where there's at least a sense of some journey over landscape, but it's also heavily symbolic and representational and
allegorical. Yeah.
Sid, what do you want to speak to that?
I'm not sure I have very much to add what's been said, except to reiterate the importance of space. I think what Rowan emphasized about the human spaces, that's something that I gravitate to. I made a brief comment on the specificity of a kind of lived experience in Herbert's poems, and that's the angle from which I would approach this. There's a certain level of abstraction in his poems occasionally, but I think he really strives not to be abstract. He strives to be very in the moment, down to earth, specific as possible. And I think that's really why I find Herbert so meaningful and so attractive, this divergence from abstraction. That's really not adding much to the conversation, except to kind of reiterate what has been emphasized so far.
Well, thank you, Sid. I have actually one. I guess we'll have to be our last question. A question for Rowan from Jason Crawford, and his question is essentially: is poetry the other of preaching? That is the place where a kind of subversive folly disrupts the language of theology or preaching. That is, for Herbert, is poetry the other of preaching? He, of course, wrote a whole famous chapter on how to preach, but is poetry the other of preaching, the place where a kind of subversive folly disrupts the language of theology or preaching? And if so, to what effect, Rowan?
It's a very good way of putting it, I think. Why does Herbert write poems at all? Presumably because there are things that can't be said just from the pulpit or just in the pulpit register. I guess any preacher who also writes poems would say that. Malcolm, I'm sure, would echo this here. And it's not just about content, it is about register, because poetry of its nature invites that pushing up against intractables. It invites those tactics of internal disruption and stressing that Herbert is invested in, because that's what poetry does. It disrupts, it stresses the ordinary flow of language. Read Herbert and you see that even in preaching, some elements of that do come in. But it is certainly as if there is something in the internal ergonomics of the imagination which requires more than just the preaching, which requires the other.
Yes. And Rowan, you used one phrase towards the end of your comments, which I wasn't able to fully write down, but it was curated, was it interruptions, curated, what you
Something
had
like that, yeah.
curated something. What was that?
I can't remember now.
It was brilliant. It's all in the recording, so we'll
Oh, well.
have to play it back, instant replay. Well, that's, of course, this is supposed to be a frustratingly brief teaser for the great conference. I love Seamus's quotation that George Herbert would love to be, is the sort of person we would love to meet. And I can honestly say that, of course, I know a number of you already, but you're the sort of people that we will all very much enjoy meeting and spending some significant time with a year hence. So thank you so much. I want to all who have attended, quite a few of you have, and listened. We are grateful for your attention. Again, there will be future announcements about the logistics of the conference at the George Herbert Society website homepage. And we will continue, of course, to send out email announcements to all who are either registered or who have submitted papers. And we will also send out announcements to our friends and members of the George Herbert Society list. So with that, I will again thank our panelists, say I'm looking forward to the full meal a year hence.